He was 6 feet deep in his own grave when the first girl appeared. Caleb Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead with dirt-stained hands, the shovel trembling in his grip. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on his weathered face as he stood in the hole he'd been digging for 3 hours straight. At 42, he figured this was how it should end. Alone, forgotten, buried in the same God-forsaken land that had taken everything from him. The wooden cross he'd carved bore simple words: "Here lies a man who surrendered. No name needed, nobody left to remember it." But as he raised the shovel for another scoop of red dirt, a shadow fell across the grave's edge. Then another, and another. 5 small figures stood silhouetted against the blazing afternoon sky, their faces hidden but their presence undeniable. Children, girls by the look of their torn dresses and tangled hair. The oldest couldn't be more than 14, the youngest barely 6. Caleb's shovel froze mid-swing. In 3 years of living like a hermit on this abandoned ranch, he'd seen exactly 0 visitors. The nearest town was 15 miles through desert that could kill a grown man, let alone children. "Mister," the tallest girl spoke, her voice steady despite the tremor in her small frame. "We need sanctuary." Caleb squinted up at them, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. These weren't town children out for a stroll. Their clothes were filthy, torn like they'd been running for days. Dried blood stained the oldest girl's sleeve. The smallest one clutched a rag doll with its head hanging by threads. "How the hell did you get here?" he growled, immediately regretting his language in front of children. "We walked," the leader said simply, "for 2 days through desert that offered no water, no shade, no mercy." Caleb felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been frozen solid since the day he'd buried his own family. A flicker of empathy, a long-dormant sense of responsibility. But he pushed the feeling down. He didn't want to care, couldn't afford to care. He was supposed to be dead by sundown. "Well, you can't stay here," he said, gripping the shovel tighter. "This is private property and I'm busy." The girl's eyes dropped to the grave, then back to his face. "They'll find us and drag us back," she said quietly. The words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. Drag them? These were children, not criminals, but the fear in her voice was real, raw, the kind of terror that came from experiencing genuine evil. He studied their faces more carefully. Bruises on the youngest one's arms, cuts on another's hands that looked defensive. These girls weren't lost. They were fleeing. "Who's trying to take you?" he heard himself ask, though he immediately wished he hadn't. "The overseers from the children's refuge," the leader whispered. "They believe we uncovered secrets we shouldn't possess." Caleb's blood went cold. A children's refuge. He'd heard rumors about places like that, whispers in saloons and around campfires. Institutions where unwanted children vanished, where adoptions were less about families and more about cold, hard currency. The smallest girl started crying, a sound that cut through the desert silence like a knife. The oldest immediately knelt beside her, whispering comfort with the practiced ease of someone who'd been protecting others far longer than any child should have to. That's when Caleb noticed the dust cloud on the horizon, a churning plume moving fast, coming straight toward his ranch. The leader girl saw it too. Her face went white as bone. "They're closing in," she breathed. Caleb looked at the approaching riders, then at the 5 terrified children standing beside his half-dug grave. Every instinct screamed at him to send them away, to climb back into that hole and finish what he'd started. But something in the oldest girl's eyes, a desperate courage that mirrored the spirit of his late wife, made him pause. The dust cloud was getting closer. Whatever malevolence these children were running from was about to arrive at his doorstep. And suddenly, Caleb Morrison had to make a choice he never thought he'd face again. Embrace oblivion as planned or fight for something worth living for, a reason to draw another breath under the unforgiving Texas sun. The sound of hoofbeats echoed across the desert, growing louder by the second. Time stopped as Caleb stared at those approaching riders, his mind racing faster than the hoofbeats thundering toward them. "Get inside the house," he barked at the girls, scrambling out of the grave. But the oldest girl grabbed his arm, her small fingers surprisingly strong. You don't understand. They brandish documents, official orders. If they seize us here, they'll force us back and you'll face charges of abduction. Abduction. The word hit Caleb like a sledgehammer. He wasn't just looking at scared children anymore. He was staring at a legal quagmire that could obliterate what little semblance of a life he had left. Then why did you seek refuge here? He demanded. Because you're the sole individual for leagues unassociated with them, she said desperately. The sheriff, the mayor, the magistrate, they all accept payouts from Silas Thornwood. Thornwood? Caleb knew that name. Everyone in 3 counties knew Silas Thornwood, the man who owned half the territory's businesses and had his fingers in every dirty deal from cattle rustling to claim jumping. The hoofbeats were close enough now that Caleb could count them. 4 riders, moving fast but not frantically, like men secure in their authority. "What's your name?" he asked the girl quickly. "Elara Thorn." Thorn, not Thornwood, but close enough to make Caleb's stomach twist. Family connection? Or just an unfortunate twist of fate? "The younger ones?" He gestured to the other girls huddled behind Elara. "My sisters, Maisie, Bethany, Lucy, and Anya." Elara's voice cracked slightly. "We're all that remains, the last of our line." The words carried a weight that made Caleb's chest tighten. Whatever had befallen these girls, it had stripped them bare. The riders were now close enough that Caleb could see their faces. Hard men with harder eyes, wearing the kind of clothes that telegraphed wealth and power. The leader wore a deputy's badge that reflected the sunlight like a threat. "Afternoon," the deputy called out, his voice laced with a counterfeit politeness that convinced no one. "I'm Deputy Harlan Pruitt. We're tracing the path of some runaway children." Caleb didn't stop shoveling. "Haven't seen any children. Don't get many visitors out here." 5 girls, Pruitt continued, his eyes methodically scanning the property. Ages 6 to 14. They absconded from the Thornwood Children's Refuge 2 days past. Like I said, haven't laid eyes on anyone. Caleb finally stopped digging and leaned on the shovel, meeting Pruitt's stare head-on. "This is private property, incidentally." Pruitt's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "We hold a warrant permitting the search of any property within a 50-mile radius. These children are deemed a hazard." A hazard? 5 terrified little girls? A hazard. The lie was so preposterous that Caleb almost laughed. But the deputy's hand resting on his gun butt suggested this wasn't a jest. "Hazardous, how so?" Caleb asked. "They witnessed an event they were not meant to observe," one of the other riders said, then immediately clammed up when Pruitt shot him a warning look. Witnessed an event. Elara's words echoed in Caleb's memory. Secrets we shouldn't possess. The pieces of a very ugly puzzle were beginning to fit together, and Caleb didn't like what he was seeing. These weren't lawmen seeking runaway orphans. These were enforcers dispatched to silence witnesses. "Well," Caleb said carefully, "feel free to search the grounds, but make it quick. I've got labor to conclude before dusk." Pruitt nodded to his men, who dismounted and began combing the property. They moved with the methodical precision of seasoned trackers, checking every nook and cranny a child might utilize. Caleb continued filling the grave, each shovel full of dirt feeling heavier than the last. Not because of the physical strain, but because of what it represented. He was burying his former life, the existence of a man who'd capitulated, and with each scoop, he was committing himself to something he'd sworn never to do again. Investing in the well-being of someone other than himself. One of the searchers emerged from behind the house, shaking his head. Pruitt's jaw tightened with frustration. "Sizable plot for a solitary man," Pruitt observed. "Must be lonesome." "I savor solitude," Caleb replied. "Most residents in these parts know to cooperate with due authority," Pruitt said, his tone taking on a sharper edge. "Those who balk sometimes find themselves confronting grave accusations." The threat hung in the desert air like the acrid scent of gunpowder. Caleb straightened up, his hand unconsciously edging closer to the pistol on his hip. "That sounds remarkably like a threat, Deputy." "Merely conveying facts," Pruitt said. "Those girls are purloining stolen artifacts. Anyone affording them haven risks being viewed as an accomplice to thievery." stolen artifacts, another fabrication to add to the mounting pile, but Caleb was beginning to grasp the dynamic at play. These men weren't motivated by justice. They were fixated on concealing whatever those girls had unearthed. The searchers finished their sweep and reported back to Pruitt with subtle headshakes. No trace of the children. But instead of looking relieved, Pruitt looked angrier. "You certain you haven't remarked anything out of the ordinary?" he pressed. 5 girls traversing alone through the desert? That's not something a man overlooks. "I'm certain," Caleb said firmly. Pruitt studied him for a long moment, then glanced at the partially filled grave. "What were you entombing? Deceased livestock?" Caleb lied smoothly. "Expired from colic yesterday. Peculiar place to bury it, so proximate to the dwelling. Peculiar to scrutinize a man's selections on his own terrain." The tension stretched between them like a wire strained to its breaking point. Pruitt's hand moved closer to his gun, and Caleb felt his own muscles coiling for action. But then, Pruitt seemed to reconsider. Maybe it was the steely glint in Caleb's eyes, the gaze of a man who had exhausted his reserve of despair. Maybe it was the realization that a shootout over missing orphans might trigger inquiries they wished to avoid. "We'll revisit," Pruitt said finally, gathering his reins. "Those girls can't elude detection forever, and when we recapture them, we'll bear in mind who extended aid and who didn't." The 4 men rode away, their horses churning up dust that lingered in the air like an ominous prophecy. Caleb watched until they vanished over the horizon, then immediately headed for the root cellar. He found the girls huddled together in the darkness, Ilara's arms wrapped protectively around her younger sisters. "Are they gone?" Ilara whispered. "For now," Caleb said. "But they'll return, and next time they might amass a greater force." Ilara's face fell. "We should leave. We shouldn't have sought refuge here. Now you're imperiled too." Caleb looked at the 5 frightened faces staring up at him in the dim light. He thought about Pruitt's threats, about the legal entanglement he was inviting, about the simple demise he'd been poised to embrace just an hour ago. Then he contemplated what kind of men would pursue children through the desert and brand them a menace. "No," he said firmly, "you're remaining right here." But even as he said it, Caleb knew that decision would irrevocably alter the trajectory of his existence, because men like Pruitt didn't concede. They escalated, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled across the desert sky, though there wasn't a cloud in sight. As night fell over the ranch, Caleb found himself doing something he hadn't done in 3 years, preparing a meal for more than one person. The girls sat around his small kitchen table, their faces clean for the first time in days, but their eyes still bearing shadows too profound for children to carry. Ilara kept glancing toward the windows, her body coiled with a tension that reminded Caleb of a wild animal braced to flee. "Tell me what you saw," he said quietly, setting plates of beans and cornbread in front of them. Ilara shook her head immediately. "The less you're acquainted with, the safer you'll be." "I'm already embroiled in this," Caleb replied. "Those men will be back, and when they arrive, I require an understanding of the forces arrayed against us." The youngest girl, Anya, looked up from her plate with eyes that reflected a wisdom far beyond her years. "We witnessed Silas Thornwood harming a woman." "Anya, no!" Ilara whispered urgently. But Anya continued, her small voice steady with the unwavering conviction of truth. She was screaming, and then her screams were silenced. The words hit the kitchen like a physical blow. Caleb felt his blood run cold as the implication sunk in. These children hadn't just witnessed abuse. They'd witnessed murder. "Where did this occur?" he asked carefully. "In the bowels of the children's refuge," Ilara said, her voice barely audible. "We were meant to be sleeping, but Anya was plagued by nightmares. We were going to procure her some water when we overheard—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "The woman was inquiring about missing children," Bethany, about 10 years old, added quietly. "She possessed documents. She claimed she was going to expose what Silas Thornwood was orchestrating." A journalist, Caleb realized, or perhaps a government inspector, someone posing excessively probing questions about the ultimate fate of the orphans. "That's the impetus for their pursuit," Ilara said. "We're the sole surviving witnesses. If we're eliminated, there are no voices to corroborate the truth, Caleb finished grimly. The room fell silent except for the desert wind rattling the windows. Caleb's mind raced through the implications. These weren't just runaway orphans. They were walking death sentences. Thornwood would never relinquish his hunt for them. And with his wealth and influence, he wielded resources that a lone rancher couldn't hope to match. There's another element, Alara said hesitantly. The woman before she was killed, she bequeathed me this. She reached into her torn dress and produced a small leather journal, its pages yellowed and worn. She decreed that if anything transpired to her, someone needed to be privy to the truth. Caleb took the journal with hands that betrayed a slight tremor. He opened it to the first page and felt his world tilt on its axis. The handwriting was neat, meticulous, detailing names, dates, and payments, a comprehensive record of Thornwood's illicit enterprise. Not merely the children's refuge, but a sprawling network of trafficking that spanned 3 territories. Children bought and sold like chattel. Some consigned to labor in mines where they'd perish within months. Others trafficked to brothels in distant cities. The youngest ones simply vanished, their destinies recorded only as bespoke requests, with exorbitant compensation amounts. Sweet Jesus, Caleb breathed, his hands shaking as he turned page after page of documented depravity. She intended to transmit it to the territorial governor, Alara said, but they murdered her before she could enact her plan. Caleb closed the journal, his mind reeling. This wasn't just evidence of murder. It was irrefutable proof of systematic evil that reached into the highest echelons of territorial authority. Armed with this journal, they could dismantle Thornwood and every individual complicit in his crimes. But that also rendered it the most perilous object in 3 territories. They know she was in possession of this? He asked. Alara nodded. They ransacked her chambers seeking it. That's when we recognized the urgency to flee. A new sound pierced the night. The distant thunder of multiple horses, approaching at a rapid pace. Too many horses for a routine search party. Caleb moved to the window and felt his stomach plummet. At least a dozen riders were converging, torches flickering in the darkness like malevolent stars. This had escalated beyond a police search. This was an all-out hunting expedition. They've amassed an army, he said grimly. Alara was already herding her sisters, her movements precise and efficient from years of practiced fear. We need to evacuate immediately. But Caleb shook his head. It's too late. They've encircled us. Through the window, he could see riders spreading out around the property, sealing off every avenue of escape. These men had come prepared for a siege, not a reconnaissance. The cellar again? Alara asked desperately. They'll dismantle this place plank by plank, Caleb said. They're aware of your presence. Maisie, about 8 years old, began to weep silently, tears tracing paths down her dirt-streaked cheeks. Lucy, barely 7, clutched her broken doll tighter as if it could shield her from the horrors to come. Caleb looked at the 5 terrified faces staring at him, then at the journal nestled in his vest. Evidence that could topple a monster, but only if it weathered the night. A voice boomed across the desert, amplified by a speaking trumpet. Morrison, we know they're concealed within. Surrender them, and we'll render this expedient. Expedient? As if there existed an easy pathway to deliver children into the hands of murderers. Caleb moved to his gun cabinet and began loading weapons with swift, practiced movements. A rifle, his pistol, a shotgun inherited from his father. What are you doing? Alara whispered. Enacting what I should have enacted 3 years prior, Caleb said, checking the cylinder of his Colt. Confronting evil head-on. You can't possibly combat them all, Alara protested. Their numbers are insurmountable. Perhaps, Caleb agreed, but I'll ensure they forever recall this night. He handed Alara the journal. There's a loose plank nestled in the back bedroom floor. Conceal this there. If anything befalls me, find a means to transport it to the territorial capital. The voice outside boomed again, closer now. You have 5 minutes, Morrison. Then we're forcing entry. Caleb looked out the window at the ring of armed men surrounding his home, 12 against 1. Not favorable odds, but he'd encountered worse during the war. The difference was back then, he'd been fighting for abstract ideals. Country, honor, duty. Tonight he was fighting for something far more profound. Tonight he was fighting for children who had no champion. "Take refuge in the back room," he instructed the girls quietly. "Whatever transpires, don't emerge until dawn." Ilara grabbed his sleeve. "Mr. Morrison, what you're attempting, why?" Caleb paused, thinking of his own children claimed by fever 3 years ago. Of the man he'd been before grief had eviscerated his soul. "Because some things are worth sacrificing everything for," he said simply. Outside, the 5 minutes had elapsed, and the first torch was already hurtling toward his roof. The torch struck the roof with a shower of sparks, and Caleb's world dissolved into chaos. "Fire on the roof!" he shouted to the girls as he kicked out the front window and aimed at the nearest rider. His first shot felled the man from his horse, the sound reverberating across the desert like divine retribution. The response was instantaneous and devastating. Gunfire erupted from every direction, bullets splintering wood and shattering glass as the ranch house transformed into a besieged fortress. Caleb rolled away from the window as lead projectiles tore through the air where his head had been. The odor of smoke was already permeating the house as flames licked at the wooden shingles above. "The entire edifice is destined to ignite," he muttered, crawling to another window for a superior vantage point. Through the pandemonium, he could discern Pruitt's voice issuing orders. "Spare Morrison unless absolutely necessary. We need his signature on a confession." A confession. They weren't merely here to exterminate witnesses, they were here to frame him for affording sanctuary to criminals. Deceased heroes couldn't refute official narratives. Another volley of shots compelled Caleb to duck as wood splinters exploded around him. He counted muzzle flashes and calculated angles. 12 men positioned strategically around the property, with additional forces likely guarding the rear. But these weren't soldiers. They were hired guns and corrupt lawmen accustomed to intimidating unarmed civilians, not engaging someone who returned fire. Caleb underscored that point by lodging his subsequent bullet in the shoulder of a man attempting to flank the house. The wounded gunman's scream rent the night air, succeeded by profanities that would make a saloon blush. "Morrison!" Pruitt's voice carried above the din of gunfire. "Those children are outlaws. You're harboring fugitives, and you're a murderer!" Caleb shouted back, pumping his rifle and aiming at another shadow. The fire above was intensifying, casting flickering light across the desert battlefield. Smoke billowed through gaps in the ceiling, impeding breathing and impairing visibility. From the back room came the sound of coughing. The girls were trapped between armed killers outside and escalating flames above. That's when Caleb recognized the diabolical genius of their scheme. They didn't require to storm the house. They merely needed to bide their time until the fire drove everyone out. Then they could allege the children perished in the inferno while attempting to evade justice. "Ilara," he called out. "The back bedroom window, can you force it open?" "It's jammed," came her reply, punctuated by more coughing. Caleb cursed under his breath. The house was metamorphosing into a death trap, but stepping outside meant walking into a crossfire that would obliterate them all in seconds unless he diverted their attention. Moving fast, Caleb grabbed a lantern and hurled it against the front wall, spreading burning oil across the wooden planks. If they desired fire, he'd furnish them with more than they anticipated. The flames leaped higher, illuminating the entire front yard and exposing 3 gunmen who'd been utilizing darkness for concealment. Caleb's rifle spoke twice more, sending them scrambling for new positions. But the victory came at a steep cost. The intensified flames implied less time before the roof collapsed, and the smoke was thickening exponentially. "The children are succumbing to asphyxiation." Ilara's voice was strained with desperation. Caleb made a decision that contradicted every survival instinct he possessed. Loading his shotgun with both barrels, he kicked open the front door and stepped onto the porch. "Behold, I'm here!" he roared into the night. "Come and claim me." The concentrated firepower that answered nearly tore him asunder. Bullets lacerated the porch around him as he dove behind a water trough, buckshot and rifle balls transforming the night into a tempest of lead. But his desperate gamble paid off. Every gun was now trained on him, affording the girls an opportunity to escape through the back. He hoped. A bullet grazed his shoulder, spinning him around and igniting fire through his left arm. Another shattered the water trough, drenching him with precious liquid that evaporated in the heat radiating from the burning house. "We've got him!" someone shouted triumphantly, but Caleb wasn't defeated. Rolling sideways, he rose with the shotgun and caught two men rushing the porch in the open. Both barrels discharged in a thunderous roar that sent them tumbling backward into the dirt. The return fire was immediate and furious, compelling him to scramble behind a pile of lumber as bullets whistled past his ears. That's when he heard it, the sound that congealed his blood. Anya was screaming. Not the scream of fear or anguish, but the shriek of a child in absolute terror. It was originating from behind the house, where the girls were supposed to be escaping. They'd been apprehended. "We've secured them!" Pruitt's voice carried clearly over the gunfire. "All 5 emerge, Morrison, or we commence severing throats." Caleb felt something snap within his chest. He'd failed. Despite everything, the fight, the fire, the desperate last stand, he'd failed to deliver them. "You seek me?" he called out, his voice hoarse from smoke and rage. "Release them and I'll surrender unarmed." "No accord," Pruitt replied. "You're both accompanying us. But if you yield now, perhaps some of these children survive until dawn." Perhaps. The word conveyed all the deceit of false hope. Caleb regarded his remaining ammunition. 3 bullets in the rifle, 4 in his pistol. Insufficient to battle through 12 men and rescue 5 children, but perhaps adequate for something else. The journal concealed beneath the loose floorboard in the back room, now filling with smoke and flames. Evidence that could dismantle Thornwood's entire operation. If it weathered the fire, if you were Caleb, what would you do? Surrender and hope these murderers show mercy to innocent children, or make one final desperate play that could save the evidence, but doom them all? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Caleb decided next would either redeem his soul or damn it forever. Moving with purpose born of absolute desperation, he began crawling back toward the burning house, not to surrender, but to retrieve the one thing that could make their deaths mean something. The roof creaked ominously above, ready to collapse at any moment, and somewhere in the darkness, Anya was still screaming. Caleb crawled through smoke and flames toward the back bedroom, his lungs burning with each breath as the house groaned around him like a dying beast. The floorboard was exactly where he told Alara to hide the journal, but now it was hot enough to blister skin. Using his knife, he pried it up and felt relief wash over him as his fingers closed around the leather-bound evidence. That's when he heard footsteps on the front porch. They were coming in. Through the smoke, he could see shapes moving through the doorway. 3 men with bandanas over their faces, guns drawn, searching for survivors. They moved carefully, expecting resistance, but they weren't prepared for what Caleb had planned. He stuffed the journal inside his vest and grabbed the kerosene lamp from the bedside table. The house was already burning, but what he needed was an explosion big enough to scatter their attackers and create chaos. Moving quietly to the kitchen, he found what he was looking for. His store of blasting powder, kept for clearing rocks from fields. Enough to level half the house. The footsteps were getting closer. "Check the back rooms," Pruitt's voice carried through the smoke. "Morrison's in here somewhere." Caleb poured the powder around the kitchen, creating a trail that led to the largest concentration. If he timed this right, the explosion would blow out the back wall and give him a chance to reach the girls. If he timed it wrong, he'd be scattered across 3 counties. "Found something," one of the searchers called out. "Blood trail leading to the kitchen." Time was up. Caleb lit the kerosene-soaked rag he'd prepared and dropped it onto the powder trail. The fire raced along the floor like a living thing, giving him maybe 10 seconds before the entire kitchen became a bomb. He dove through the window just as the explosion tore through the house. The blast was devastating. The entire back wall disintegrated in a shower of wood and flame, the shockwave knocking down 2 men who'd been guarding the rear. The 3 searchers inside simply vanished in the fireball that erupted from what had been the kitchen. Caleb hit the ground hard, his ears ringing and his vision blurred from the concussion. But he was alive. And more importantly, he could see the girls. They were tied to a wagon about 50 yards away, surrounded by the remaining gunmen who were now stumbling and disoriented from the explosion. Pruitt was shouting orders, but his voice seemed to come from underwater. Anya was no longer screaming. She sat perfectly still, her small body rigid with terror that had gone beyond sound. That's when Caleb saw something that made his blood boil with rage. Ilara's dress was torn in a way that had nothing to do with their escape attempt. Her face was bruised, and she held herself with the careful posture of someone trying to hide fresh pain. They'd assaulted her. These animals had put their hands on a 14-year-old girl. All thoughts of strategy and survival burned away in a furnace of pure fury. Caleb rose from the rubble like an avenging spirit, his rifle speaking death as he charged toward the wagon. His first shot took down the man closest to Ilara. His second sent another gunman spinning into the dirt. The remaining men scrambled for cover, but Caleb was among them now, fighting with the savage intensity of a man who had nothing left to lose. A pistol barked to his left, the bullet creasing his ribs and spinning him around. He answered with the butt of his rifle, crushing the shooter's skull and snatching his weapon. "Eliminate him!" Pruitt screamed from behind the wagon. "Eliminate him now!" But Pruitt's men were discovering that there's a difference between murdering children and fighting a man who's already considered himself dead. Caleb fought like a demon, using every dirty trick he'd learned in 2 wars and 3 decades of frontier living. He grabbed one gunman and used him as a shield while putting a bullet through another. When his makeshift protection died, he threw the body at Pruitt and rolled behind a water barrel, reloading with hands that moved automatically despite the chaos. The tide was turning. What had started as 12 against 1 was now 4 against 1, and the 4 remaining men were starting to break. But breaking men were the most dangerous kind. "Enough!" Pruitt roared, pressing his gun against Ilara's temple. "Drop your weapons or I blow her brains out!" Caleb froze, his rifle halfway to his shoulder. Through the smoke and firelight, he could see Ilara's eyes, brave and defiant even with a gun to her head. "You're finished, Morrison," Pruitt panted, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "Drop the guns and maybe I'll make it swift." Caleb looked at the remaining 3 gunmen, all with their weapons trained on him. At the 5 girls tied to the wagon, their faces streaked with tears and soot. At Ilara, who was trying to mouth something to him despite the gun against her skull, the word she was forming was clear run. But Caleb Morrison had run from enough things in his life. His family's death, his responsibility, his chance to be the man he should have been. "You know what, Pruitt?" he said slowly, lowering his rifle. "You're right. I'm finished." Pruitt smiled triumphantly, relaxing slightly. That's when Caleb pulled the hidden derringer from his boot and put both barrels through Pruitt's chest. The deputy's gun discharged as he fell, the bullet going wide, and chaos erupted again as the remaining gunmen opened fire. But something had changed in that moment of defiance. The girls weren't screaming anymore. They were fighting. Ilara had worked one hand free and was untying her sisters. Maisie and Bethany were kicking at their captors. Even little Anya was biting the hand of the man trying to hold her. And Caleb Morrison was no longer the broken man who'd been digging his own grave that morning. He was something much more dangerous. He was a man with something to protect. But as he reached for Pruitt's fallen gun, he saw movement in the distance that made his heart sink. More riders, at least 20 of them, coming fast from the direction of town. Thornwood himself was coming to finish this personally. 20 riders thundered across the desert like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. But Caleb Morrison was no longer the same man who'd faced 12. The journal pressed against his chest like a talisman as he helped Ilara cut her sisters free from the wagon. Blood streaked his face from a dozen small wounds, and his left arm hung uselessly from the shoulder wound. But his eyes burned with purpose that hadn't existed 12 hours ago. "Can you ride?" he asked Ilara quickly. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite everything she'd endured. "Take the wagon. Head north toward this canyon. There's a hidden cave about 3 miles up the ridge. You can hide there." "What about you?" Maisie asked, her 8-year-old voice trembling. Caleb looked at the approaching dust cloud, then at Pruitt's body sprawled in the dirt. The remaining 3 gunmen had scattered when the shooting started, but they'd be back with reinforcements. "I'm going to buy you time," he said simply. Ilara grabbed his arm. "You can't fight 20 men." "I don't have to fight them," Caleb replied, pulling the journal from his vest. "I just have to make sure this survives." He pressed the leather-bound evidence into Alara's hands. "Get this to the territorial capital. Find someone who can't be bought. A newspaper editor, a federal marshal, someone." "They'll kill you," Alara whispered. "Maybe," Caleb admitted. "But they were going to kill me anyway. At least this way it means something." The thunder of hoofbeats was getting closer. As the firelight from the burning house, Caleb could make out the lead rider, a tall man in an expensive suit riding a horse that cost more than most people made in a year. Silas Thornwood, the devil himself, come to clean up his own mess. "Go," Caleb urged the girls now. But Alara hesitated, her young face torn between survival and something that looked disturbingly like loyalty. "You rescued us," she said quietly. "No," Caleb replied, checking his remaining ammunition. "You redeemed me." The girls climbed into the wagon, Alara taking the reins with the competence of someone who'd been forced to grow up too fast. As they pulled away toward the canyon, Caleb felt something ease in his chest. For the first time in 3 years, he'd done something that mattered. Thornwood's riders were close enough now that Caleb could see individual faces. Hard men, professional killers, the kind of scum that money could always buy. But at their head rode Thornwood himself, and that was a mistake. Rich men should never lead their own dirty work. Caleb positioned himself behind the overturned water trough, using the burning house as backlight to silhouette his targets. He had maybe 30 bullets left between his rifle and the weapons he'd scavenged. Against 20 men, it should have been hopeless. But Caleb had advantages they didn't know about. He knew this land, every rock, every gully, every shadow that could hide a man or stop a bullet. He'd spent 3 years learning every inch of this property, mapping it in his grief-led mind during long nights when sleep wouldn't come, and he was no longer afraid to die. "Morrison!" Thornwood's voice cut across the desert as the riders pulled up just outside rifle range. "I hear you've been harboring criminals." "I hear you've been enabling the butchering of innocents," Caleb shouted back. Thornwood's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Those weren't innocents, Morrison. They were potential sources of trouble for my establishment, and that makes them disposable." Caleb spit. "And the woman? She was an employee, Morrison. You can't believe everything you read." "Employee, huh? The woman that threatened to reveal all of your secrets and lies? Things happen, Morrison. Just like the accident that's about to happen to you." The rich man gestured to his hired guns, who began spreading out in a wide circle professional movements designed to surround and eliminate. These weren't the sloppy amateurs Pruitt had brought. These men knew their business. But so did Caleb. His first shot dropped the man trying to flank left, the sound echoing across the desert like judgment. Before the body hit the ground, Caleb had shifted position, rolling to a new spot behind a pile of lumber. The return fire was immediate and devastating, but they were shooting at where he'd been, not where he was. His second shot caught a rider trying to circle behind the burning house. The man's scream spooked his horse, which bolted back toward the main group, creating confusion in their ranks. $20,000 to whoever brings me his head, Thornwood screamed, his composure cracking as Caleb proved harder to kill than expected. $20,000 enough to make even loyal men consider betrayal. Caleb used their greed against them, firing deliberately at the men who seemed most eager for the bounty, create paranoia in the ranks, make them wonder who they could trust. His strategy worked. When he wounded a third man, 2 others immediately turned their guns on each other, each suspecting the other of trying to claim the full reward. But the diversion only lasted seconds before Thornwood restored order, with threats and curses. "Burn him out," the rich man commanded. "Man, set fire to everything, flush him into the open." New torches blazed to life as Thornwood's men began systematically igniting every structure on the property. The barn caught first, then the chicken coop, then the small shed where Caleb had stored winter feed. Soon he'd be surrounded by fire with nowhere to run. That's when he heard something that made his heart leap with hope and terror in equal measure. Gunfire coming from the direction of the canyon. The girls were in trouble. But as Caleb started to move toward the sound, Thornwood spotted him in the firelight. So, that's where we leave Caleb, standing against impossible odds, but armed with a renewed purpose. It's a story about finding a reason to live again, about the extraordinary courage of children in the face of unimaginable evil, and about how even the most broken among us can find the strength to fight for what's right. Ultimately, it reminds us that even in the darkest of times, hope and humanity can still ignite a powerful flame. What did you think of Caleb's decision? What would you have done? I'd love to hear your thoughts and interpretations in the comments below. Let's get a discussion going. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future narratives. Thanks for listening.